Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the next update to the Ontario Provincial Election Series. So, there's been a lot of polls this week. I mean, obviously, there was going to be a lot of polls because the election just started, so that is to be expected. But even with said expectation, there's been quite a lot of polls, and much has changed. Now, I will say, just to start off, I think the last update, I don't think it was wrong. I think it was correct as per the polling. I think the polling was a bit erroneous regarding to the NDP because if we just flash over here real quick, as we can see, the last week's update to now, NDP's jumped nearly 4 percentage points and they dropped nearly, 2.4 percentage points the week before. And from 2 weeks ago, they lost 4 percentage points, but they're about where they were 4 weeks ago. So, I think there's been, this wasn't entirely unexpected because a lot of the polling was being done based off of just one pollster, Main Street in this case. And it's not that Main Street itself was wrong, it isn't a bad pollster. It's that when you have one data source, that one poll or that one pollster can have an error through no fault of their own by random sampling, and that can lead to results. That's why aggregate models are much better for understanding elections than polling, like just raw polling, because any individual poll can be wrong, and you can probably find a poll to support any conclusion you want to support. Whereas an aggregate poll model like this that has all sorts of polls being considered, it's a lot more robust to individual fluctuations. Now, where does this put the Ontario race? Well, the Ontario opposition has rescinded from peak vote splitting, and now they're just heavy vote splitting. About last week was peak vote splitting, and I believe, I don't have the map off hand here, but I believe the NDP and the Liberals together were forecast at, I think, 34 seats, and now they're 37. So, a bit better performance collectively for the NDP and Liberals, but not much better. And it might be surprising to some, perhaps, that the Liberals are doing better than the NDP and are getting fewer seats than them. But that shouldn't be too unexpected because the Liberals are very much Eastern Ontario, Toronto, and to a lesser extent the general GTA area as a whole. Whereas the NDP are very strong in the north, strong in the urban south. They're terrible in the rural south, but the urban south, like Windsor, London, Hamilton, lesser extent Niagara, Toronto itself, they're not very good in the GTA, but they're decent in Brampton. So their vote is more concentrated. As we can see back, if we flash back over to this guy, we can see here they have 30% in the north right now, 26 in Hamilton, 24 in the general south, and about 27 in Toronto, whereas the Liberals have 32 in Toronto, 29 in the east, and 28 in GTA, but everything else is quite low. So, that's why that's happening. Now, assuming, let's just go here, that the last week's model wasn't erroneous or did not underproject the NDP solely because the polling. Let's say the polling wasn't entirely wrong before then, or entirely underestimating the NDP before then. What is a possible reason that the NDP might bounce back? Now, there's a couple here. I don't think they're always the most robust ones. I do personally think the polling was just slightly off is a more accurate or more likely response, but let's follow through this one. Well, we're going to flash back here because it'll be easier again. Where has the NDP gained votes from? They've gained votes from we're just going to blanket assume that the people who've lost votes have went to the NDP in broad strokes. That's not That is literally not true, but we're just going to pretend it's true for the sake of argument here. So, the Liberals have lost about 1.5 percentage points. PCs have lost about 0.3. Greens about 0.5. Everybody else collectively maybe 1.5. Where have these people gone? Or why would some of these people switch? Well, the Liberals, one possible reason the Liberals could be switching, especially if you look at places where the Liberals took the most damage recently, which is North and Toronto. One of the big labor unions in Ontario, probably the world, or well, Anglo world, but specifically Ontario, LiUNA, came out recently, endorsed Doug Ford, which is quite interesting in and of itself, but has been running attack ads against the Liberals specifically. I believe they're not even really commenting too heavily on the NDP, so they're heavily attacking the Liberals. So, this could potentially have caused some of the pro-labor part of the Liberals to go, and switch the NDP. From the pro-labor NDP Liberal swing voters might have been pushed back to NDP from this. That is one option. Del Duca had a big bump. We can see here. Since I've been tracking week to week, he's had a big bump up into May 1st. So it could be the case that some of the novelty that has propelled his bump here has diminished. Actually, I should go back to this one. That'll be easier. So that's also a possibility. The case for, let's say, the Ontario Party, New Blue, and PCs, it could just be random fluctuations on their part. I will note New Blues took a big hit, and I don't strictly think it's because the party is doing worse now. I think it is a case that I was overprojecting them. There have been the polling is not very clear about these smaller parties that have little seats and that are brand new. But there's been some polls recently that have had the New Blue out, and they've had them at 1 to 2% range. So I've recalibrated how I'm considering other as a group, because previously I was giving. So the other column has contained the Ontario Party, New Blue, and every other party, and I was separating out Ontario and New Blue based off of the occasional polls that do record them. So I've rejigged that. So that's a large portion of the reason that they've dropped a bit. But overall, if we just consider this entire category other, it's possible that there's just been some fluctuation with that, poll over poll, and not really meaningful. Maybe they've dropped out of the election, so they're no longer considering voting. Perhaps they are NDP Ontario Party swing voters. I would be very surprised, but it's not impossible. Now, the Greens are kind of a big question. There's not been much in the news about the Greens, so it could be just that. It's been a bit over 2 weeks now since the NDP platform came out. Maybe it's disseminated well enough among the average person that maybe some Greens are like, NDP have a better chance of winning than the Greens, and their Green platform is good enough. Maybe. That could be a reason. So there is possible explanations other than polling error, though polling error, I think, is the more likely outcome or more likely result because, well, realistically, I was using 1 to 2 polls a week, or the last week projection was based on 1 or 2 polls, I believe. So there's a lot of room for error, whereas this week has had 8 new polls added to the model, so it's much more robust to individual errors or biases by pollsters. Now, one other thing I will note, I noted this last week, and I'm going to note every single week until the election, unless the model changes, I have zero confidence that the PCs are going to actually pick up these 2 Hamilton seats. I think this is just the model being erroneous, because once again, I'll reiterate, every single pollster has a different definition for Hamilton, Niagara, and or Central Ontario and Western Ontario. Central Ontario being the rural parts of right here added to Hamilton, Niagara area. So there is no clear definition of what's what, and possibly maybe sometimes they consider Central Ontario like over here. So some of these sub jurisdictions are very difficult to parse, and I do try to fit them in the model, and I do try to do some statistical interpolation to try to make it make more sense. But I'm not super confident because I haven't really, particularly Hamilton Niagara, or sorry, Hamilton specifically, I'm not very confident that I have come up with a good way to interpolate basically the rest of Ontario, because North is very clear, East is very clear, GTA and Toronto are very clear. It's just the rest of the parts of the province are not very clear pollster to pollster, so it requires interpolation on my part to try to figure out which areas should be included, etc. So it is not... I haven't really worked out a method I feel very comfortable to. So again, Hamilton, I'm not optimistic that the PCs will actually pick up these 2 seats. Some other things that are worth noting: some of the largest seat changes week over week, more or less since the model has started really recording, is GTA, and it's between the NDP and the Liberals. They're bouncing, or sorry, in Toronto specifically, and it's mostly the NDP and the Liberals bouncing back and forth on who controls what seats. So, of any election that has occurred recently in Canada, this is the closest to a 3-party race, because, in a sense, there are 3 parties actively competing against, with all 3 of each other. Whereas nationally, generally speaking, you have ridings that are NDP conservative swing, such as rural BC or places in Saskatchewan, etc. And you have places that are liberal conservative swing, which are basically rural Atlantic Canada and maybe the GTA. And then there's very few places that are NDP liberal swing. They exist, like Halifax, downtown Halifax, or St. John's East, but there's not many of them, so it's not really a proper quote-unquote 3 parties. Though maybe in this sense, this isn't really quote-unquote 3 parties. It's 1 and 2 half parties, if that makes sense. This is, at this moment, based on the most recent round of polling, particularly the regionals, because I will also note these last 8 polls that have come out have a very broad consistency between them. They broadly agree on almost everything. There's some differences here and there. Some record men slightly more for the PC, some can record them less. But for the most part, it's largely within margin of error for the sample sizes given. So there's a huge broad agreement here. It's a very consistent round of polling here. So with that, assuming that tracks, and assuming Doug Ford has a decent campaign performance, he doesn't need a stellar one, just an okay one. He's the incumbent. He should cruise his way to some level of win. Probably majority, because I think he only needs to have 67 seats for majority, and he's currently sitting at 86, so he has room to lose ground. But he's pretty set to comfortably cruise there, and it's really a race for second place right now. And don't underestimate this, especially if you are NDP or Liberal watching this video. The race second place really does matter in this regard, because if the Liberals retake second place by a comfortable margin, I'm talking popular vote and seat count, I think what you'll see is the same thing that happened to the NDP in following 2015. They will decline, federally, that is. The NDP will decline provincially, and the Liberals will reassert themselves as a second place party. However, if the NDP maintain a solid second place, again in popular vote and seat count, right now that is neither result, because the Liberals are slightly more popular overall, but the NDP are winning slightly more seats. But if the NDP can have a comfortable popular vote and seat lead over the Liberals again, they might displace the Liberals as the default second party. 2 elections in a row where they come second place in popular vote and seats. It doesn't take too many more of those before people, broadly speaking, on the left in Ontario, accept that the NDP is the primary vehicle for opposition. That's how party changes happen in first past the post. You have your primary party that controls, for lack of better terms, the left side of one side of the spectrum, and you have a challenger party. And if the challenger party can displace that one, the primary party, for a couple elections, then people will start gravitating towards it, and then it's kind of self-fulfilling momentum, and then the two-party system factor of first past the post kicks in. That's why you rarely will see a third party last, let's say, 20 years. It's not a hard and fast number. Obviously, the NDP have existed for a while, and the UK Liberal Democrats have existed for ages. But broadly speaking, unless your party is extremely concentrated support, like the Bloc, a third party does not last long in first past the post, because either they displace the original party that they're contesting, i.e. on their side of the political spectrum, or the party on their side of the political spectrum absorbs their beliefs and they become redundant. Another recent example, for the most part, though if you are Brexiteer, you might not be super happy with this, the UK Conservative Party has basically absorbed UKIP by adopting the Brexit referendum in 2015 and actually doing it and getting Brexit done, quote unquote. Though a lot of people I'm aware of in the UK who are pro-Brexit are not very happy with how Brexit was done. They don't like the North Ireland Compromise and stuff like that, but that's a topic for some other time if I ever get to UK videos. Which maybe, but oh man, UK is a lot of writings. That's a lot of data. So where are we going here? Well, this is a rather quick election. I think the election date's on June 3rd. If I was a smart boy, I would have looked into this beforehand, but I'm not. So, I mean, correct me in the comments, my Ontario viewers, if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it is June 3rd. I think, whatever. It's early June, regardless. So there's only about a month here. And actually, at the recording, or by the time the release of this video will be, May 8th? So, there's only going to be really 3.5 weeks of campaign left before the election day. So there's really not a lot of time for things to change. I'm not a huge fan of Canada's 40-day election periods. Like, a lot can happen during an election, but it's very brief compared to what you have in France or the US, where you have a lot of pre-campaigning before the election officially begins. There's really not too much in Canada for that. Maybe that's a result of Westminster system, actually, but regardless. So there's not a lot of time for things to change. Obviously, a lot can change, and especially look around for the debates, because when the debates eventually happen, I'm assuming there's going to be debates, but why wouldn't there be? But anyways, when the debates do happen, look for that. That's probably going to be barring someone making a mistake, the debates will probably be the only inflection point that could exist in the campaign right now. I just don't see anything going anywhere else. Doug Ford seems to be relatively stable in the high 38s range, 38, 39 range. He seems very stable there. Maybe there could be consolidation among NDP Liberals, but again, there's only so much consolidation I think can happen between those two parties. I suspect 2018 was about the peak the NDP could pull from the Liberals normally, i.e. that would be like their saturation point of pro-NDP voters, per se, and at that point, any other support would be just anti the other candidate, i.e. if people were tired of Doug Ford, they might vote NDP, but they wouldn't be voting NDP because they like NDP, if that makes sense. They're voting NDP because they really just want a new government, and they're the next choice. That makes sense. So there is that. And I suspect, frankly, that is not going to happen this campaign. I just don't. It's rare to see a party removed from power after one term, especially in a Westminster system. It's also especially rare to see such a divided opposition coalesce in an election campaign. Potentially they could erode more seats. But the big issue for the NDP and the Liberals are, if they start getting very close to unseating Doug Ford from a majority, not even necessarily defeating him, but just removing his majority government, and specifically removing their Doug Ford's majority government, well, they look like they could form a coalition government with just the two of them, or possibly if you add the Greens as well, then I think you'll see, going back here, that a lot of these Ontario and New Blue Party voters will probably go back, hold their nose, and vote Doug Ford. They don't want to vote Doug Ford right now for plenty of reasons. I mean, if you look at the platforms of both parties, it's very clear why they exist different from the PCs. But in the end of the day, if there's a difference between a PC government or a Liberal NDP government, I suppose my supposition is those two parties will vote PC to stop it. At least in places where it's a contested election. Which, frankly, is actually one of the reasons why I think things like this are quite... groups like my channel are quite good for the health of a democracy, because seeing where, especially in the first past the post system, seeing where things are competitive lets you know when you should consider strategic voting and when you should just vote conscience. Because, yes, strategic voting is a factor of life, and before anyone tells you, I mean, I'm covering in my other series, but before anyone tells you, strategic voting exists in literally every single system. It's just the degree and the type and whatever. But anyways, the important thing is, it doesn't feel good to always strategically vote, but sometimes, for example, if you are in this riding, I can't think of the name of it. No, let's go with this one. I can't think of this one either, but I do know this one is currently sitting at 60% PC support. So if you are sitting in this riding, and you do not like the PCs, for whatever reason, they're not right-wing enough, they're too right-wing, Doug Ford is a clown, I don't know. Whatever reason you could come up with that you don't like the PCs, if you're in that riding, you can just vote whatever party you feel like. Whatever party you like. Now, you might think, well, we're not going to beat the PC incumbent there, so what's the point? Well, the point is, you can show to the riding, i.e. the candidate in that riding, who does win, to the province as a whole, to the party you supported, that there is support for that party. And the important thing, in the first past the post system, and this is where I really think our civics classes should really go exist. Actually, I don't think they exist. Maybe Ontario has them, but in Nova Scotia, we literally don't have any civics classes. They barely explain how elections work or the government works or anything. But this is one of the real tragedies of not explaining how this works to people. The point of voting for a third party in a first past the post system is not for that party to win. If they win, that's great. It happens occasionally. The CAQ in Quebec is a perfect example. It does happen. But the point of voting for a third party is not strictly speaking that party could win. The point of voting for that party is to show the other parties that this party has a serious idea or is talking about a really important issue that we do not feel like you're covering, and we want their more attention to this. A Canadian example, the Green Party has essentially forced every other party to talk about environment either seriously or lip service to it. Now, frankly, I think every party's actually paying lip service to it, and a lot of times it's virtue signaling. But regardless of how sincere and genuine the parties are about handling things like the environment and to what degree they think it needs to be handled, but regardless of that, the Greens have forced that to be an issue that people have to talk about. You see it in the media. People always say the Conservatives don't have a serious environmental platform. What? Does it matter? That's a story for another time. But they've changed the conversation. The Greens have never had any single pipe dream of winning an election. They've never come close to winning an election. Their best result was 3 seats, and then they immediately did worse than that the next election, 2 years later. And you could argue they only did 3 seats in 2019 because people really didn't like Scheer, Singh, or Trudeau. So they had the benefit of every other party just no one liking them, liking their leaders. But that is the point of these parties. So in places like, I can't think of this one, but whatever this one's called, where the PCs are currently forecast to be 60% plus, you can go there and you can vote your heart's content. Support any party you want. You are free to do that. There is no strategic voting concerns you have to consider. It's actually kind of liberating in that regard. And yes, I'm 100% saying everyone here should vote, because you cannot convey this message without voting it. You can get polled, I suppose, but polling is, for example, I'm signed up to do a lot of polling lists for online polls and stuff like that. Even then, I'm not polled very frequently. I'm on all the lists. I do not get polled very frequently. An election, sure, also not very frequent, but is the perfect time for you to come out and do something, because it takes you not that long. You can say something with your vote, and it does, in fact, matter. I can confirm this 100%. I've worked in some election war rooms. Well, not war rooms. That's overselling it. But I've worked with some campaigns before, and they do consider people like that. So third-party votes and stuff like that. It is considered. People are worried about it. They do plan about it. So do not get fooled by hubbub that, your vote is irrelevant because you can't possibly win. No, not every single vote is about making a win. Same thing here. Overall, provincially, it doesn't actually matter, per se, for the Greens to gain seats. If the Greens gain vote share in the province, it really shows the rest of the province, people are really concerned about the issues the Greens care about. Similarly, if the Ontario Party, the New Blue Party, has a fantastic showing, that shows the province that there are people who are very serious about the issues these parties represent. It looks like the Ontario Party is more socially conservative, and the New Blues, I don't really have a good feel. They're conservative, for sure. But they're kind of, I don't know how to describe them. Maybe they're, hear me out here, maybe they're quote-unquote true blue brand, whereas Doug Ford has kind of shifted more into a red Tory wing of the conservative umbrella, though he's not quite there. He's like straddling the line, so it's a bit unclear. But if either of those two minor parties has a meaningful performance this election and a meaningful performance next election, it really shows to the PCs that they have to be worried. They don't have a monopoly on right-wing voters. They have to consider that package. Nationally, the People's Party has done that to the Conservatives. And in a way, you see this right now in the current Conservative leadership race, where some candidates, I don't think necessarily they're intentionally doing this, in the sense that they sat down one day, came up with a bunch of things that people who vote for the People's Party like, and it's like, we're going to do that. No, I don't think anyone did that. Not a single human being in the entire world has ever done that. Well, that's an exaggeration, but probably almost 0 people have done that ever. What has happened, though, is people have looked at, okay, why are the Conservatives losing votes? They look at, people are dissatisfied. They don't like the status quo. Look at People's Party, they don't like the inflation. They don't like the disaffection of the political system. They feel like unheard. You get candidates like Pierre. What is Pierre catering to? Those people. Did he sit down in a room and try to figure out, how can I go to People's Party voters and convince them to vote for the Conservatives? Probably not. It might have been discussed, but he did not sit down and come up with a platform for that. He sat down and looked at issues that existed in Canada that people did not think the Conservatives were dealing with well. And that's what parties like People's Party and the Greens are for. Now, you have a third type of party. You have the Bloc, which is not present in any analogy of the Bloc in the Ontario election, but that's a regionalist party. And, well, I think that's self-explanatory. Now, what do we have to watch out for going forward in the Ontario election? Well, hopefully we get enough polls, because polls, as much as I moan days I get polls, because it takes a lot of work to actually, put them in a model, but the more polls we have, the better the model is, so it's kind of goes both ways. What we are looking for here, though, is does this situation, what we have right here, does it hold? Do the PCs hold in the high 30s, and are the Liberals and NDP stuck in the mid to low 20s? Each, that is. I do not think the PCs have a single chance of losing unless one of the NDP and Liberals start polling above 30 consistently. And after the last round of polling, that doesn't exist. So that is the one thing to look out for. And then once one party is polling above 30%, then it's a question of where. Because as proven in the federal election, you can have more votes and lose if your votes are too concentrated or too dilute on the other end. But with that, I'm going to end this video here. And if you like the video, please like, share, subscribe. If you want to hear the random thoughts on polls and other things that come up, you can follow me at Twitter on Twitter at @BagelPolling. Link will be in the description. Otherwise, though, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.